Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on Enlight Software and IBM webinar. I'd like to thank everybody for the time you're going to be spending with us. And we're going to be talking today, fortunately, to a customer who's been with Enlight Software for more than 4 years. Today, we're going to be talking about IBM's deployment of Enlight Software, and we're going to be talking about the key DCIM elements at IBM and specifically about their implementation. Fortunately, today we have an IBM veteran, John Miller, who's senior technical staff member and DCIM architect at IBM. He's going to be talking about their deployment and some of the things they considered when doing their deployment and the things they've learned from implementing data center infrastructure management. John, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. Yes, when we first started looking at this, we were looking at business needs. We needed to know what exactly it is we're trying to resolve, and then look for a tool and processes, et cetera, that will help us accomplish that. So what you're looking at, we put together on the what we call the legacy environment. We sort of mapped where we were, and we had a lot of the component parts that comprise a more formalized DCIM kind of tooling, but they were piece parts, and we, many different tools that we had lashed together and that worked okay, but not optimally. So what we were looking for was something that would help us bring those together in a very much more structured fashion. And certainly we found that with Enlight. We looked at two key things after we put together a brainstorming list of dozens of items that we wanted to resolve. We kind of netted it to these two that you see: data center resiliency and data center resource optimization. And a couple of bullet items below those that I'll point out. Obviously, we were looking for the kind of robust infrastructure that we needed and redundancy of power and network, but also we wanted to kind of forge into the predictive capabilities and failure simulation, as well as obviously looking at standardization with a deployment that does go worldwide in IBM across all of our GTS organization. With that, we are also looking at the optimization of it. It always comes up that we want cost takeout, but we also recognize there were revenue generation kind of things that we could do here. Obviously, we wanted to be able to address the main physical elements: space, power, cooling, network, and in fact bring in additional elements on to build on that basis. We wanted to be able to also talk about not just the tool, and when we do talk to our people, when we talk about a new deployment of this, we make sure they understand it's not just the tool, it's data, it's the application itself, but it is processes and workforce, because all of that needs to come together in order for us to succeed with this. So we knew that going in. At the same time, we had to explain a little bit, well, why is DCIM different than, say, data center facility management or the IT service management? And we said that it really is sort of the bridge between the two of those, because on the one hand, we're looking at DCIM to pick up where DCFM somewhat leaves off, working the high-level infrastructure, building level, campus level kinds of components. So when we say that we do power and thermal management and network, et cetera, they would say, yes, we do that too. The problem was that we needed to really bring it down to a much more granular level as we're working with our specific accounts that we have in IBM, which we're more than 1,000, almost 1,600 accounts that we're dealing with, of strategic outsourcing, as we call it, our main business in GTS, where we're working with each one of those has their own network, has their own area in one or more data centers. And so we needed to orchestrate that in a way that we could have an architecture that really spread over all of that, but at the same time brought it together. So we're not working with 1,600 different companies, so to speak. It's really, from an infrastructure standpoint, we needed to look at this as one unified kind of system. So we were looking at, as you can see on the chart, everything from assets to communication, and several different skills and things that we needed to do. Each one of these, we previously had a tool to do that sort of thing. And when we looked at this, we recognized that the entire architecture of it needed to be such that while I may focus in on power or network or cooling from sort of a vertical kind of standpoint, that they all needed to be architected such so that they share data and at any time we modify one of the component parts to add new capability, for example, that it still fits in with that architecture. It just gives us a better, faster, easier way to do some of the things. But at the same time, it was already something that was accounted for. It's not like you are tacking on things ad hoc here. It's that you're continuing to build this on a common architecture. What we've tried to do with this was, as again, the bullet items here of orchestrating the collection and analysis and compliance. As I mentioned, it does extend the traditional DCIM level of what they address and takes it down to this lower level, predominantly trying to bring it down to at least a rack level, and actually down to the individual assets that the people are using. But and it's through this that we, it helps us promote the efficiency and accountability. As I said, with bringing in the workforce, we can now kind of track who's doing what, when, has it been done, et cetera, to drive efficiencies, not only from a tooling standpoint, but from making the workforce more robust, because we've armed them with better tools. So with that, we looked at Enlight Asset Optimizer as our tool that this is the predominant tool we're using today. There's a few others I'll talk about in a moment that we intend to append to this. But with this, we recognize the need to do asset lifecycle management, doing the workflow management, as well as capacity planning, CMDB connectors, and reporting. Those are the primary initial things that we've done with the Asset Optimizer, and I'll show you a little bit about each of those in the next slides. So this slide addresses a number of different views that you'll see in the Enlight Asset Optimizer tool. In particular, the numbers 1, 2, 3 represent the floor planner view, the cabinet planner view, and then what we call an asset planner view. And with those 3 views, which seamlessly are integrated, we can take care of looking at not just the physical aspect of it, but also the things that physical as in location, but things like ownership, and connectivity of all of this stuff. So these 3 tools that are the 3 views that work in combination are sort of the core to managing the actual physical facility, and they supply us the capability to define our location portfolio, drill that down to map level, blueprint level, if you will, work interface with the tools, with the equipment that's on the floor, whether it's cabinet or standalone mainframe or DASD, and at the same time drill down, peel the onion, however you want to say, to the next level of components. So in this particular example, it's going from a cabinet to a view of the cabinet. In this case, I happen to pick one with the blade chassis so that you'd see when you go to the asset view, it actually even exposes the chassis level down to the blade level, and then every single blade within that can be drilled down into from an asset level. So you get all of the parent-child relationship that you need with going through this mechanism. At the same time, even jumping back to the floor layout, it's not just the physical layout in terms of what fits where, but you're also looking at giving enough area to capture your thermal heat dissipation requirements. You're looking at clearances on equipment. In this case, you're looking at zones or areas, as they call it in Enlight, that demarcate the different accounts that we have, which can then be looked at individually in terms of the areas and utilization of equipment or other resources that are used within those zones for billing purposes. So a lot of data to soak in on this one slide I made, so it would sort of capture that continuity across the way. The last thing I'll say on this one is when you do get to the asset view, number 3, you've got a whole host of views within that you can go to that expose a number of the different elements you can work with. So we'll talk about that later. The other thing that it does is where I showed you sort of the very visible parts of it, the physical side that an end user would see walking through the data center. This is sort of the back end hidden stuff, and which is all the networking and power connectivity that you get into. And when we were looking at tools, one of the things we understood was that once you've gone beyond just assets, which are already difficult enough to try to maintain, all the records on that, the life cycle, et cetera, that going down to power level as the next step we had taken has sort of added that, times 10 in terms of the number of connectivity that you have to be able to track and basically validate so that you can do maintenance such as cutting off your A or B side power and recognizing if there is something that's exposed to single core device, et cetera, that you can alert someone to the fact that that will go down or to have it shifted over. At the same time, we were looking at network, and as you can see just from the slide here, just a regular rack brings in, it makes the power look easy. So it really got to the point where we just said, guys, you cannot do this manually anymore. You have to have automation to be able to put this together and create it and maintain it. But at the same time, once we have this, then there's so much you can do in terms of efficiencies, cost takeout. When you're adding a new device, you don't have to go do a survey every time to see if it'll fit and do I have the capacity, et cetera. It's all in the system that you can now pull that kind of information out and say, yes, in fact, let me look, I'll tell you where the optimum placement is for it, taking all of these parameters into account. And that was the core reason for DCIM, is that it lets you look at all of these things, but also bring it together in a cohesive manner that you're not putting it in just because there's space available, but you're putting in because there's space, power, cooling, and network all there, or you know at least what you might need to improve in order to make it fit. So very, very efficient. The other module that we were using within Enlight Asset Optimizer is workflow. And this is one that we initially started with what we called administrative workflows, which were to help us with some of the what we called infrastructure items of the tool. And as we were working with it, we considered those things like adding business groups, support groups, adding locations, and in fact maintaining or adding materials that are somewhat operationally day-to-day kind of activity. And what we ended up doing was putting together standards and some templates on how to do that, but then embedding those into a workflow so that every end user had the capability to click a workflow and in fact identify that that's something that they needed, like a new material, et cetera. At the same time, it then brought it forward to an administrator level, guys who are more expert at doing those specific tasks and completing them, if you will, and at the same time ensuring there's no duplication and that we got the right access and security levels as well for being able to look at, for instance, a particular account. The area that followed that though was a very robust initiative to do what we call the IMAC-D lifecycle for install, move, add, change, and decommissioning. In this case, looking to build on an end-to-end scope. This allowed us to actually sunset several applications we were using and build them into one cohesive application with the lifecycle capability, and at the same time still integrate some externalized kinds of steps of this to some of our enterprise systems that were not going to get displaced altogether. So with that, we kind of looked at the Enlight lifecycle workflow, and as they point out, from inception to decommission, and we really actually kind of built ours independently of this initially, or at least the plan for it, and then came back and looked and found that it was very, very close to this. We hadn't initially added the decommissioning part of it, but we've since partnered with asset management in IBM and have in fact added that, as well as goods receiving that we'll talk about later, to accomplish. So effectively now we're doing pretty much every step you can see here. So this was very good pattern for us to work with. So with that, let me jump over to one of the other tools we're looking at, and that is the Enlight Energy Optimizer. So again, use cases that this is one of the charts that Enlight's provided for us to let us look at what this will in fact do. Is a very good introduction to the tool to have the use case slides. And with that, we recognized, of course, the power failure and simulation I mentioned before was something we wanted to do. Obviously, the capacity planning so that we more fully utilize our energy, and at the same time, energy being one of those elements that if you manage it, you can do cost reduction. So that obviously hit that point. And we knew that with this, we could do both branch circuit monitoring and or power strip level monitoring with it, and also have the alarms and we could do this at the fact that we do have some co-location sites as well as internally owned and facilitated sites. And at the same time, obviously improve labor, because with the tools, and once we've taught people how to use the tools, it generally has moved them from spreadsheets and some of our previous notes applications to more real-time data that tends to help us build on like workflow capability, where everything's sort of a sequential step that builds towards even being able to do work orders and things like that, instead of passing around spreadsheets and not even knowing where you are in the process. So with that, we did a proof of concept on this over a year ago, and we're now looking at a full-scale deployment of this, in fact, in our IBM cloud area of our business. With that, we're going to pick up, as I mentioned, the alarming and predictive failover analysis. I don't have a slide for everything that we were talking about, but I kind of put a collage together here of a few of the slides just to, in particular, show you where you will have the floor map, just like you did in the NAO module. In fact, it will inherit that from NAO if you do put the two together. You can run this as a standalone application, and it will still accommodate the things I'm talking about. But so in this case, we're looking at a particular rack that we highlighted on the floor that if you click that, it will bring up information about that. In this case, we were seeing that it has 2 power strips on it, which can then be further decomposed, in this case, as the 3-phase power strips down to the individual banks on those strips, so that we can ensure we're not overloading any portion of the power strip itself, which was actually a nice surprise for us. We didn't recognize that it came with that capability, that we were thinking power strip level monitoring, but it really does take it down to the 3 banks, which we always want to make sure that people aren't overloading, and they have to know where to properly distribute the plugging on that, so that we don't just load it up on one phase. At the same time, you've got your history. You can choose what frequency you want to capture that, and over time, there's a method that's in place that will condense that down as you get, so in other words, you can save, as much time as you want on this, but you can set it so that, after the first week, then it instead of keeping, 90-second intervals, it's taking 15-minute intervals, etc. So you can still see trends in history without overloading your storage capacity for, or if you even wanted to do that, you could just add more capacity on storage. At the same time, this interface provides us with alarms and alerts. So right now it's showing in green over here, but if something was a little out of standard here, it would start blinking either yellow or red to indicate the urgency of that. But it would allow you to very quickly zoom into where that issue is and resolve it. In many cases, you may be able to do that prior to any actual failure, but at the same time, this would provide all the kinds of, in combination with NAO, you could tie it to your workflow and in fact have that as a standard workflow that could communicate, the fact that you've had an alarm or an alert or an outage, and have that pass to the appropriate entity, organization that's going to have to address that. So the next thing we were looking at is Enlight Asset Explorer. We also have done a proof of concept of this one, and this is one that has some interesting uses. The most important to us initially, as we were looking at this one, because our group that has deployed this in IBM is basically, we're a group that actually sits into what they call GTS, Global Technology Services, and we interface with our real estate optimization group, but we're not part of that group. We're actually, the group we are is predominantly more the ITSM side. So it's kind of an interesting area, sort of in between the two, like on that slide I showed earlier. But at the same time, what we recognize with this one is that this tool does a lot of things beyond just the facility management and DCIM level management scope that we were looking at. But that opened an opportunity for us. What we knew, of course, of other groups within our GTS organization who are the ones who facilitate moving a client, say, from their data center into an IBM data center or vice versa, or consolidations within our company and data centers as we may open up a new one and want to sunset an older one, which are obviously huge initiatives if you've ever been involved with one of those. So with that, we have reached out to those teams and said, look, there's a set of things that we want to do, that why we want this tool. And predominantly for us, what this provided was the capability to do the network management, the network connectivity, port-to-port connections, where it would discover those and enable us to import that data. And I mentioned before how detailed that amount of data was on that chart. That was one that compared it with power. You could see that, and that was just a normal rack. You put it into a network rack, and it's just like an incredible amount of data and points that you have to put together, and at the same time try and do that without making any mistakes on it. Explorer, with the scan capability that it does, comes back with absolutely true, trusted data very rapidly that shows you every juncture of that path of that network, so that you can then address that with a specific bulk data management capability tool that is going to help you assess that. You can build rules to go ahead and accept it just as quickly as possible, or others that'll pause and let you review and then accept. And this way you can very rapidly build your power network. Okay. Now, in addition to that, it opened up the door for quite a few other things. And one of the things that I'm just going to show you one front end slide on the tool. This one on the left-hand side over here, you see a bunch of blue folders. What that means is after this particular scan, every folder in blue captured certain information about those different elements of processor, memory, system, etc. What you're looking at here is just the overview, and this is just the first screen that I could fit on for the overview. The overview itself is actually fairly robust. So as you get down to this, you get over 400 data elements, attributes of your system when you run this thing, and it takes about 30 seconds per on the first pull you do, where you want to pull everything, about 30 seconds per piece of equipment. But it'll also pull not just your physical, but all your virtual information. It'll get you down to chip level and core capability. And this has a high value to some of our other groups in IBM as well, like asset management, who's looking at managing software asset licensing. This is a way that they can recognize, the number of cores, et cetera. If you've ever done Microsoft licensing or other companies, even not just Microsoft, but that are going to look at these kind of parameters that you would not necessarily be tracking in a facility kind of organization. But this is one that bridges the gap, but also enables you to validate at the asset management level, not just down to the software level, but it also helps you validate the actual machine type, model, serial number, a lot of these parameters that if you didn't catch day one when you were receiving the equipment, or if you're even deploying a tool like this after the fact, as you may have found out, it's very difficult to go, if you haven't recorded it somewhere already, the serial number, something as simple as that. It's not like you're going to go pull a server out of the rack to go find it. There's too much risk of disruption or failure, or knocking a cable off to do that. So what this will do, it'll actually find that even without tracing cables and all that sort of thing. You'll know from the IP address link that this box is exactly what it says, and be able to improve the quality of the data that you have collected if you were working before you have this kind of tool. The other thing this Explorer does is there's a particular API that Enlight has worked out in partnership with ServiceNow to be able to, in a very robust manner. This is actually the look at the view that you would see if you were moving data between the two systems here. So once it's pulled up, that wealth of data I talked about on that scan, it can, as much as you want, you can share into your ServiceNow system, so that you now have the change management, and the fact that, in fact, particularly in IBM, this is one of the systems we had moved to pretty much universally across our company for the change management system. But now you can have them synchronized between the Enlight and the fact that there is certainly a set of trusted data. You'll see in this next slide here, we kind of identified the fact that with Enlight, there's a certain amount of stuff like the physical locations and move, add, change kind of changes that you're going to get into, or even the what if scenarios that you then implement through move, add, change, and the resources. These are things that aren't generally going to be sourced from things that are pushing into ServiceNow from the IT side. But what this allows us to do is to marry the two together, so we can identify that, yes, this is the trusted source for these kind of elements, but it ties in with these and also provides the synchronization between the ITSM. This is where we're fully completing the bridge. What I mentioned before, the DCFM, this is kind of bringing in almost fully the IT service management side that we talked about. So the last thing I'll mention is if you don't have a module from Enlight that does everything you need it to do, then they have a wealth of standard APIs that they have worked out with other companies. One I mentioned with ServiceNow, others like with RF code for RFID kind of capability. But what they also have a documentation that would help you, even if it's not one of the mainstream third-party applications that they've already worked with. It will provide you with the information you need to take even a homegrown application that you may want to integrate, which we have done in one or two cases, research developed kind of things, very robust, but not generally third party and maybe not even commercialized yet, but we can still bridge those in to the system so that we can still bring in and collect the kind of data that we want to with the system. This is what I said before, DCIM being sort of the core repository to what is really only as limited as your imagination as to what you can bring together. So I end with this. Why is it so important to us? Well, hopefully I hit on a lot of those points, but to be very specific, yeah, it helped us address some of the challenges we were dealing with. We so many times had what we called grassroots level ideas and never got sponsorship for it, but we still had to go make it happen. Which obviously a lot of times led to what we called heroic effort of, some poor guy that got a project to go implement that wasn't really acknowledged, and maybe it was an uphill battle every step of the way. But now with this, it's become more of an organization-wide adoption and understanding that, this is not someone having to learn something as another aspect of their job. It's how they can take this tool and apply it to their job, and that's what we were looking for, was that this helps them do their job better. And it has, I always use the phrase that, because I hear this all the time, that there's a lot of pushback. Everyone knows when you're changing something and introducing something new, but it's like 3 months later you'll hear back from people saying, how did I live without it? And that's kind of where we are with this right now. It's helped us to exploit opportunities in terms of driving the resiliency of the data center. We've been able definitely to share applications, not just sunsetting and bringing together some that we owned that were generally single use, but bringing them into this common kind of platform. But it's helped us to truly reach out to numerous other competencies that in our organization that generally weren't really looking directly at facility stuff, but they were looking at that some of the stuff that they dealt with would maybe have been something driven by a change in facility or a failure in facility or something that now we can give them better heads up, even if it's a weather related kind of thing that you have to just prepare for and be able to move workloads or something into a less risk area for a certain amount of time. this is where it brings it together, that they can look at those kind of things and build those into the modeling as to, you know, what to do, when to do it, and with the absolute certainty that, you know, they're using data that is good to work with. So this has also helped us, as I mentioned in the chart here, address, you know, some of the cost takeout items, big cost takeout items, things like, you know, like I said, as we're looking at sunsetting entire data centers and consolidation, and at this stage in our IBM's what we're doing here in terms of moving a lot of workload, you know, from the traditional kind of environment in the hosting arena to cloud environment, or maybe what we find is it's generally a dissemination, some to cloud, some that we retain in the customized kind of environment, as well as at the same time moving more into VM systems, et cetera. So it helps all of that, which is well beyond the facility arena, but it's supporting that kind of capability for those who are in the IT area and asset management area to streamline, consolidate, remove any what we call zombie servers that just were left and abandoned, so that we're not just wasting space and power, you know, for those kind of things. So it's provided that kind of structure and discipline, as I say right here, so that we can, and not just for the tooling and the data, but also, you know, for the workforce, you know, to recognize they can see a process now, they see a beginning and an end, they know where they fit in, and it's just much easier to work with people when they understand exactly what their role is and the importance of their role in the overall stream of things here. So we talk a lot about capability maturity model when we're talking about tools, and I kind of defined that in a way earlier when I said it's bringing, you know, your process, your application, and your workforce all together, and that's what we've ultimately done here to improve our posture and capability and maturity. We've defined the things, we've used a tool now that can do it, but ultimately to get to the maturity instead of capability, it means you actually do it. And that's where we've come to with this. And we're looking at, like I said, some of those other modules to take us a little further on the path. So let me end there. And Mark, let me hand this back to you.
All right, sounds great. Well, thank you, John, for that very informative presentation. We have a few questions for you here, so why don't I just get to them? So the first question, John, is how do you enter data into Enlight? Is it manually entered?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's two thoughts on that one. One, I'm working with a team now that actually seems to think manually entering data is data that they can't use. And I have to remind them that someone somewhere generally has to enter data. It doesn't always just originate from an automated system. Now, sometimes it does, but things like, you know, ownership, location, business, well, I mentioned business groups, but there are things that absolutely do have to be entered manually. The thing is that what Nlight provides is a capability to, you know, you can go in through the general user interface, graphical user interface, and enter that, you know, a single item at a time. You can use templates of certain things if you're going to repeat the process, or in fact, copy and paste, which is certainly an automation thing. The whole basis of the assets is what we call a materials template or table of thousands of what I'll call object-based kind of entities that where you can just use those, and they'll have 80% of the data that's pertinent to that particular machine type model already built in into that, and then you just customize it with the additional elements like serial number to make it unique as an asset. But it also provides bulk data management as a core generic capability of the tool, that you can work with pretty much every type of material category, machine, you know, server, storage, network. There are multiple categories, power strips, everything that you need, facility devices as well as IT devices, and put that in a bulk fashion. So if someone's got it in spreadsheets already, if someone's got it in a previous system, you can always. What we did was actually migrated ours from a previous system, and we're able to batch up actually groupings of 10,000 racks at a time. by using that capability. So when they talk about hand entering, yeah, it's not something that's going to go completely automated. I mean, the closest to that was, as I mentioned, the Asset Explorer tool, which does give you that scan capability and the ability to, yes, let it go, in fact, populate it automatically, or pause it and review it. But at the same time, it's very robust in terms of the automation it does bring to doing steps that were before 100% manual.
Okay, great. The next question, John, is how does Enlight facilitate cost takeout?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. And in fact, I doubt anyone in the business today now gets to deploy a tool unless they can explain how it's going to address cost takeout. Obviously, we pointed out things like resiliency as being the most important, but to avoid cost from service level agreement penalties and things like that. But as far as the cost takeout, there are some I kind of consider the, how can I put it, the operational level kind of cost takeout, things from just the synergy of tools, going to one common set of tools instead of multiples. I mean, you've cut out training, you've cut out, obviously when you do that, you generally, not that we're looking to get rid of people, but at the same time, you'll find that you don't need as much of a workforce to do it if you're using a common set of tools and standards, and a lot of the stuff that where you spent time trying to reconcile data is not needed anymore. Sharing data between organizations that we've done, and in fact, the synergy we talk about is actually looking at completely integrating, and I thought we'd never end up doing this, but with like asset management, I've mentioned a few times, because they're an enterprise level facility in IBM, and I thought, yes, we'll end up being able to communicate with them, but we're right now in the midst of doing a full-fledged integration of some of their primary tools, and when they speak of Enlight, they talk to that as a trusted source. So those are the kind of things that help us with some of the, I'll say, the day-to-day operations and takeouts, and the fact that, like I said, when you can get down to metering, some of the, like everything from the physical placement to the power utilization to this and that and the other, among other things, you'll also see, and I guess I know some people very much define the cost takeout and basically cost avoidance as completely different, but in some ways, they're very similar. And I would say that in cost avoidance, it's extremely helpful that we can, with the having everything mapped that exists and being able to do what if scenarios on what we want to do in the future, and looking at where we can optimally place things and how we can fully utilize the capacities that we have now, instead of trying to say, well, I don't want to get it too close, but because I really don't know where that threshold is. Now you'll know where your thresholds are. You'll know how far you can take it. You can certainly drive your utilization of your data center to a much higher level, significant levels higher. I mean, we were seeing some running at, like racks at, 30% utilization that truly could have held at least double that. And now we're optimizing and using that because we know that it will in fact accommodate that sort of thing. So yeah, those have been some of the things, Mark, that we were addressing.
Okay, well, thanks. That's a very deep answer there, John. Here we have a very specific question, which is, how does Enlight address power resiliency?
Yeah, the power resiliency, like I said, was one of those top two things I mentioned at the very beginning. And the reason one of the reasons we netted that down to two was we said to do resiliency, you really had to do a whole host of other things to make sure. I mean, you have to know what your assets are, you have to know what your connections are, and that was the key thing, really, was that making sure that we actually did that we had the right device identified, that we had the right ports and plug outlets and everything identified, and that we were in fact following what we could map out with the system and identify as the optimal at first we mapped out what we had, and then we're able to recognize that if we had some anomalies that needed to be corrected, we were in fact on the same PDU with both A and B side, or in fact even on the same switch gear that fed it. We found that even that, we can trace it all the way upstream on power as far as you need to go to ensure you get the maximum diverse paths into that. That was one thing. The other I mentioned was, with Neo being able to go down to the bank level, and which effectively is almost down to outlet level on a power strip, to ensure that we're not overloading, even at that level, at the power strip level itself, to causing an error there that's going to cascade through something else. And at the same time, since with your connectivity and the fact that that connects back from power strip to receptacle through your PD breakers and poles and everything else, that you at every single juncture you recognize not only the primary load but the failover load that's associated with that. So on the one hand, it was mapping out what we had. On the other, it was then providing the capability and the planning capability with workflow and work order creation as to what, as you hand this off to a person who's going to deploy and execute the plan, he's got the instructions there, exactly where to plug this in, what ports to connect up, etc. So it really takes out a great deal of the user error in the system, because it's gone in almost a sequential build mode of the plan that one guy may put it in, another guy that's a designer may look it over and approve it and tweak it, and ultimately to the physical guy who's got very crisp instructions as to exactly which port and outlet to plug for this stuff. So that's been a huge thing to address that resiliency concern.
Okay, John, thanks for that answer. We have one last question we're going to have here, which is, what role does InLight play regarding regulatory compliance?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is one I didn't think I was going to get into directly when we were, but people have heard in IBM about Enlight, and I get calls all the time from groups outside of my own that say, hey, I heard of this, and can it help do this and that? And one of the groups that I work with is our corporate environmental affairs here in IBM, and I work very closely with them because they look at things like carbon footprint, and also they're working with regulations and committees with the federal government, et cetera. And in fact, these guys also participate on some of those groups, so they can help influence that as well. But one of the latest ones, and I'll just use this as an example, that they had come to me and asked about was something they call SERT, or CERT, or Server Efficiency Reporting Tool. And what was interesting about that one is when he showed that to me, and the fact that you're now measuring not just the traditional kind of power usage effectiveness, or PUE kind of measurements, which we've done for many years on the facility side. They're starting to look more at what is the overall efficiency of your data center, and are you in fact using your resources wisely and not just running a huge facility well, but that it's actually that all the energy that's going into it is in fact using being used where it really needs to be, down to the IT equipment and the compute power. So that's kind of what this brings in. And to do that, you really had to get into the level of data that I mentioned on the Enlight Asset Explorer tool, and for that CERT measurement, because in order to do that, you have to get down to the chip level, the chip speed. You have to know, within the device, and if it's got multiple chips, et cetera. And then you're marrying that data with some of the traditional facility kind of parameters as well. Because frankly, they've told me that, just like that, well, similar to the STAR program, that this is one that's going to eventually be deployed and may even have influence whether or not companies can sell to federal agencies, or maybe in the future even sell it all in the country. If they're not following these kinds of guidance and can report as to their how well they are complying with that. So at least they've told me it's very important that we do get on top of that, so that we have that capability for that. Obviously, the other things that we're talking about from a regulatory standpoint is of course, the power on, power off of PDUs whenever someone's looking to add a new circuit or something. I mean, that's definitely an OSHA requirement that we make sure to shut that down. So, and of course, every time you shut a system down, an A side, B side power, it exposes you to high risk and of a failover or failure of your system unless you've mapped it out as we described. And in fact, so we've done that not only for the fact that you may have an act of God kind of failure, or lightning hitting your transformer or something, but also the fact that just because someone, especially in our environment where we're adding in new service strategic outsourcing companies that we bring into the data center, there are thousands of new connections that we're doing every day, not every day, every month, thousands a month of that we would have to shut down PDUs in one center or another to accommodate that, and we are doing that, and it's only because we have the resiliency mapped out now that we can do that without risk or minimizing the risk to a great degree of that won't cause some kind of outage.
There's just a ton of information in this webinar overall and in the answers to the questions. We really appreciate the time you've given us here. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure, Mark.
All right, and I'd like to thank again everybody who's been listening to this webinar, and we'll look forward to seeing you on a future webinar with Enlight Software. Thank you.